So first we're going to go through the basics of the Blender interface. It's a big program and can be kind of intimidating at first, but once you learn how to navigate your way around, you'll find it's actually pretty simple. So Blender is a free program that you can download at blender.org, which there is a link in the project description. Then once you open Blender, you will get greeted with a scene like this, which gives you a light, a camera, and a default cube. So first of all, if you're serious about 3D, you're going to want to consider getting a 3D mouse, but we can actually go up here to the preferences and you can look into the input, and there's the option to emulate a 3-button mouse where Alt left will work as a middle click, and you're also going to want a number pad, but if you do not have one, you can emulate a number pad, and this will use the 1 to 0 keys at the top of your keyboard. It's important to note that down here I have changed some of my default settings. I changed my spacebar action from play to search, and I turned on my tab for pie menu. I find that to be a lot more user friendly, and you will see us using that later in the video, so just wanted you to be aware that those are my settings. You will be able to see the keys that I'm using down here. Blender has a lot of keyboard shortcuts, so I just wanted you to be aware of what keys I'm clicking as I'm moving around. First of all, let's look at how to navigate around this viewport. So by middle clicking, you will rotate around. If you select an object and press period on the numpad, you will zoom in on it, and then you can zoom around that object with your Alt mouse click. If you hold Shift middle click, you will move side to side and up and down. It's called panning. Then if you hold Control and middle click, you will zoom in and out. To select objects, you just left click them. Right clicking them gives them plenty of options. Over here, you can see how to move our objects around with these tools. So we have these, what are called gizmos. So you have the move gizmo, the rotate gizmo, and the scale gizmo. And the move gizmo lets you move that object around. The color of each gizmo corresponds to the axis that it is rotating, scaling, or moving on. Green is Y, X is red, and Z is blue. You also have this little gizmo up here that you can use to drag around or click to snap to different views. You can also access those viewports up here by top, bottom, front, back, right, left. You will know what viewport description you are in by the description up here. You can also access those by pressing the numpad. So 1, 3, 7. 7 gives you top, 1 gives you front, 3 gives you right. If you hold Control and click a number, it will give you the opposite. For example, if you hold Control 7, it will take you to the bottom view. To exit that view, you just click and move back around. It can be a bit difficult navigating in 3D space if it's your first time, so take some time to get used to it. Pressing 0 takes you to the camera view. Again, if you just click, you will move out of that. And those are the basics of moving around the viewport. Now, you've seen how to move with the gizmo, but you can also select an object. And let's go up here to our selection mode. And you can hold G and move your object around. If you tap the axis, so if you press X, it will only move it on the X axis. And if you hold G and tap X, for example, and hit 5, it will move it 5 units on the X axis. -5 would move you back 5 units. The units are measured by default by metrics, though you can change those over here in the settings, which we'll get to that a little later. So those are kind of the basics of moving around. If you can't remember the shortcut or you can't remember where to click a button, every viewport in Blender has all of its options accessible up here. So you can see that you have add, object, transform, move, rotate, scale. And if you just look around these menus and take the time to read through, you can see that you can access pretty much everything up here. Another way to access information is by pressing the spacebar and searching. So you can select a lot of things from here, and you see there I typed move and hit enter, and I can move it around. If I hold left click, it'll put it in that place. If I hit right click, it'll reset it to where I originally grabbed it from. So those are the basic navigational points in Blender's viewport. Let's hop into how we can add objects. Again, you can add those objects by clicking up here, but we can also hold Shift A. So if we hold Shift A, we have mesh, and we can select all these meshes. Curves will allow us to add curves. There's a couple advanced options here. You have text, grease pencils for 2D, armatures for rigging characters. Empties are objects you can use to kind of hold information, almost like a null in After Effects. You can add images, lights, cameras, and those are the main things you can add that we will be using in this course. Over here, by the default view, we have our navigation point here. Up here, we have an outliner. An outliner is almost like your organization center. So we can take this, which is currently called collection, which is like a layer if you're familiar with After Effects or Photoshop, and we can call this default cube. We can twirl that up and down. And over here, you see we have these eyeballs, which will turn off the visibility in the viewport, but when we go to render our final image, those will still render. If we do not want our objects to render, we can click this little checkbox here, and that will turn off them being able to render and also turn them off in the viewport. So that's the basics of the outliner. Again, there's a lot of options here. You can click up here and see more there if you want to filter things or add more options to allow you to select certain objects easier. Over here, we have our properties panel. Now the property panel holds all of your render information and your dimensions information and your render passes. And some of these we'll go through when we get to the final lesson video where we discuss rendering out a video of our character. But for the most part, these are kind of advanced, so we'll save those for the end of the video. The thing to note is that this is object dependent. So if I grab this object, you see that all these properties change. So now suddenly we have all these options for our cube, relations, mesh data, things like that. The ones we'll be using the most are this little wrench right here, which allows us to add modifiers. So for example, if we wanted to add a subdivision modifier, it's going to add geometry and try and smooth out our object. You can see that because we had so little geometry, it kind of crushed our square and turned it into a sphere. So we can just delete that for now by clicking this little X. We also have here what is our material panels, which is where we can add shaders and textures and things like that. And now to delete something in Blender, it's kind of backwards. You hold X and then hit delete. You don't use the delete key normally. So we can also right click our object and you'll see that we have some information that we can access there. We'll be using a little bit of that later. Moving on, let's say that we want to change the look of the viewport. So up here we have the different views. Now because I have the tab on, I can hold Z and switch between those different views, or you can click them up here. So we have wireframe, which will show us the wireframe of our object, you know, how it draws lines from vertice to vertice. If we click here, we have our solid viewport shading, which is what we have there. This is called Look Dev. It kind of shows you your shaders and other things. It gives you an idea of what your render look like. And then here's kind of a preview render mode. So this will actually render your object in the scene and show you what that scene is going to look like when you hit render just with lower settings. Let's switch back here to solid mode. If we click this little area, you have plenty of little kind of tweaks and things you can do there. You can change the lighting of the scene and things like that to help customize your viewport to better serve whatever project you are on. We click up here, we have overlay options. This allows us to turn off different things. So here we have the 3D cursor, so we can go ahead and turn that off. We can turn the floor off, we can turn the axes off, we can turn off anything up there to kind of clean up our viewport if we feel things are getting too complicated. So those are the basics of navigating around the viewport. The last thing I'll go through is how to kind of customize your viewport. So you can see right now by default, we have the properties panel, the outliner, a timeline down here, and our viewport. But let's say we want to add a new window. We can do that. It's going to create a duplicate of this window. To change that window, you just select the little icon up here and you can choose what window you want down here. If you want to close a window, you click down in the corner and you drag back over and it'll show you an arrow showing you what way it's going to collapse. Now by default, Blender is going to open in layout mode. But up here you see that it has various little tabs here where they have preset layouts for you. We have a modeling tab, which makes it easier to jump right into edit mode with all of our tools. Here we have a sculpting mode that switches us into sculpting mode and gives us all of our sculpting tools. We have UV editing mode, which will set up our object and our UV map over here. A UV map is kind of like unwrapping an object so that you can apply textures to it and paint textures onto it. Here we have the texture paint mode. This allows us to paint textures onto our models. We have a shading mode, and this will give us a file browser, an image editor, and this will show us our shader graph down here and our viewport up here. By default, switch to Look Dev mode so that we can get an idea of what our shader would look like. So for example, if you wanted your character to hold a glass in his hand, you could add a glass shader down here. Animation shows us our camera view, our viewport, and gives us a dope sheet down here. A dope sheet displays your keyframes. If you've ever used animation software, this is going to be very familiar to you. Rendering will show you what your render looks like after you've hit render. Compositing allows you to composite effects on top of your render so that you can add more flare color correct, or do other special effects. Some people use Blender for visual effects on live action video. And here we have a scripting tab. This is very advanced, and this is for developers who want to add features to Blender or run scripts within their scenes. But for now, let's jump into sketching a character that we can use in our scene.